Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the July 12, 2021 Delta Plan Interagency Implementation Committee meeting, also known as DPIIC. I'm Susan Tatayan, Chair of the Delta Stewardship Council, and as such, I serve as Chair of DPIIC. I'm glad we're able to meet virtually today. So for those tuning in to DPIIC for the first time, I'll give a bit of background on why this committee exists. The 2009 Delta Reform Act required the Delta Stewardship Council to establish and oversee a committee of agencies responsible for implementing the Delta Plan. This committee of top leaders from 18 federal, state, and local agencies seeks out ways to strengthen collaboration and better integrate our authorities and actions. DPIIC meetings provide a public forum for dialogue about opportunities to align and drive actions affecting the long-term viability of the Delta. So with that, I'll ask Amanda Bull to introduce the DPIIC members able to participate in today's meeting.
Yes, good afternoon, everyone. So today with us, we have Susan Tatayan, Delta Stewardship Council, Chuck Bonham, California Department of Fish and Wildlife, Kathy Marcinovich with NOAA, National Marine Fisheries Service, Jane Reed, U.S. Geological Survey, Joaquin Esquivel with the State Water Resources Control Board, Larry Goldspan, San Francisco Bay Conservation and Development Commission, Don Natoli, Delta Protection Commission, Ellen Blake, U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, Campbell Ingram, Delta Conservancy, Paul Souza, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, Nancy Vogel, California Natural Resources Agency, Leslie Gallagher, Central Valley Flood Protection Board, Cindy Messer, California Department of Water Resources. And let me see if I've missed anybody. I don't see anyone else of the members, unless anyone I missed in there.
I just moved over Cindy Tejeda.
And Cindy Tejeda, U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. And then if anyone else joins, we'll bring them into the fold.
Great, thank you. Thank you, Amanda, and thank you all for being here. So on to agenda item 2. As you probably know, last Thursday, Governor Newsom added 9 more counties to the already 41 counties proclaimed under a drought state of emergency. So how do such dire conditions affect ecosystem-based management in the Delta? For some context and answers, I'll hand it over to our Department of Fish and Wildlife Director, Chuck Bonham, who has generously agreed to moderate today's in-depth look at some challenges we face in carrying out ecosystem-based management during drought. Chuck?
Thank you, Susan. As facilitator, I'll definitely sign up for the context setting. I'll leave a lot of the solutions to the panelists that'll come behind me. It's true, my name's Chuck Bonham. I'm director of the Department of Fish and Wildlife. And what I should first acknowledge is most every face I see on the Zoom is intimately involved in the state and federal effort with our local jurisdictions fighting this drought. So I don't proclaim to be any greater expert than Campbell or Paul or Don or Chad, everyone else we see in the Zoom. I just happen to be the one Susan asked to kick off the panel. There's a couple of things I'd like to do as panel moderator, and they really are designed to draw a bigger stage, expand the aperture. So drought, as you know, is part of our history in California, and it's going to be part of our future. We live in a Mediterranean climate. This place we all call home has been subject to the variability of water since time immemorial, before statehood. California is really defined by the interannual and intra-annual variability of water, from periods of scarcity to periods of abundance and back and forth. I was looking at a periodical, kind of a daily news source called EE News. Some of you may be familiar with this morning. And one of the stories was titled California Grid Waivers as Temperatures Soar to 130 degrees. And within this article, there's a particular paragraph that caught my mind I wanted to restate. It said, quote, "It's a difficult start to summer on the West Coast. Record heat blanketed the Pacific Northwest and British Columbia in late June. Temperatures at that time soared to 120 degrees Fahrenheit in Lytton, British Columbia, a village northeast of Vancouver that was burned to the ground by a wildfire days later. Portland, Oregon hit a new record of 116 Fahrenheit 2 weeks ago, and temperatures at Seattle-Tacoma International Airport soared to 107, the highest ever recorded in the area. Over the weekend, temperatures this weekend soared in parts of California and Nevada. Death Valley, as you might have seen, reached 130 degrees Fahrenheit on Friday, matching a record set last August. Before then, such heat had not been seen anywhere in the world since the 1930s. So we often hear a lot about, are we living in a new normal? It may be the case we're actually just flat out in the middle of a period of change. A period of change that has cascading effects across multiple attributes, a combination of heat and power grid, fire, soil, hydrology changes happening, maybe best captured by the classic visual. Imagine a series of dominoes standing upright, and you tip one, and we're living through a series of events where one event is causing another, so on and so on. So perhaps new normal might be a way to talk about it. My headspace is we're living in a period of change. The change is cascading so quickly, our typical way of doing business isn't keeping up. Here's the example that strikes home for me, this dynamic in the world of water. Vanishing snowpack has stunned most of us. Paul Rogers wrote a pretty comprehensive article about this in the Mercury News back in June. I think all of y'all have seen this information. Certainly Chair Esquivel has hosted workshops at the board about this. We are in today, after 2 years, an experience that is about the height of the impacts and severity of the last drought, which occurred over many more years. April and May of this year were unusually hot for long periods. The soil of the lands in California have been incredibly dry. April 1, the Department of Water Resources told us its annual snowpack percent of normal estimate was about 59% of average. As you know, the department runs a vast network of arrays across the Cascades and Sierra landscape and takes an aggregate rolling percent of average. April 1, 59% of average. By May 1, that snowpack level was down to 22% of normal of average. By June 1, 0%. The combination of heat, dry soil, we missed our estimate. About 685,000 acre feet of water did not make it into the major store reservoirs in the state and federal system. As Paul wrote in the Mercury News story, that's about 40% more water than Los Angeles City uses in a year. He converted that to another factoid. That's twice as much as all water uses in Santa Clara County in a year. The cascading effects, a period of change, domino effects. And think about that in respect to back in 2019, we had a massive snow season. I can attest to the snowpack, having skied it very late into the spring and early summer. Then in April 1 of that year, DWR had our snowpack percent of average at 154% of average. Just 2 years later, here in July, 0. What has happened at the government level in the state? I would summarize first with a restatement of a series of actions Governor Newsom has taken. Back in April, end of April 21, with Chair Esquivel, Secretary Ross, I believe Secretary Namath, Secretary Crowfoot, Director Namath, I gave Carla a promotion there real quick. We're in the Russian River watershed at the headwaters of the Russian River, where the governor declared a drought proclamation for very specific parts of California, because for us, declaring an emergency through a proclamation is really a trigger for the Emergency Services Act and is tailored to grant authorities to deal with an emergency. One should be judicious in the use of those authorities, I think, rather than overreach. So at that time in April, a proclamation created an emergency state for those particular localized areas because of the extreme hydrology then parties knew. The government at the state level also forecasted we would adapt over time as the hydrology would also potentially worsen. So by the time we got to May, I think May 10th, those leaders with the governor assembled again and expanded that proclamation. So by the middle of May, 41 counties were captured in this emergency services proclamation, which gives us and government authorities to do things like waive procurement rules so we can acquire supplies more quickly, think drinking water, or deal with permitting around particularly important things, our reservoir management, to manage the risk about carrying water over rather than releasing it downstream. And then most recently, as Susan mentioned last week, the governor did two things. He expanded the proclamation aspect to include 9 more counties. Think Inyo, Mono, Santa Barbara, basically everything now north of the Tehachapi's. So 50 counties, which I would bet is probably 40–45% of our population now within those counties for those emergency authorities. And simultaneously, the governor announced an executive order asking all Californians to step up and take simple actions and to voluntarily reduce their water use by 15% compared to 2020 levels. That brings us up to date in a lot of the things that have happened. And before we turn to the panelists, what I think occurs often when we talking heads get together and speak about climate change is we leave ourselves in despair, sadness, and perhaps depression. I know this is a risk we have when we engage with the general public. We describe how bad the situation is, and the public is left wondering what it can do to help. Well, there are some things it can do to help. Every drop of water we can conserve will help California prepare for next year if it's as dry. Every drop of water we can conserve will also help nature because nature needs water too. There are things you can do like shrink the time you take a shower, fix leaks. The governor's executive order announced last week illustrates some of those simple voluntary steps and infuses cash and investment into the Department of Water Resources Save Our Water campaign, which was prominent at the middle of the last drought. And Californians know how to respond to the call because during the last drought, per capita residential water use declined 21% between the years 2013 and 16. And today the urban sector is using approximately 16% less on average statewide than in 2013. If we as Californians can conserve an additional 15% voluntarily, we could save as much as 850,000 acre feet of water. That supplies water to about 1.7 million households. And I guarantee you, if next year is as dry as this year, we will be having a conversation next year about even more difficult decisions. I also think as we move through this drought, we're in a broader, better prepared state. The governor's leadership, the legislature's leadership, a several billion-dollar package of immediate drought response and long-term water resiliency investments are now in play. Since the last drought, Joaquin has gone out with his state water board and completed an assessment of drought risk across thousands of water suppliers. And the administration has developed recommendations based on feedback from stakeholders. Our Department of Water Resources has a new dry well website, which didn't exist, if my memory's right, in the height of the last drought. We've streamlined our water transfer process. The State Water Board has provided early notice, much earlier than last drought, to tens of thousands of water users around the state about planning for scarcity and the potential for curtailment. Amazing work has happened at the Department of Agriculture to get our agricultural communities even more resilient with efficiencies by the time we get to this drought. That's a big picture. Step back. Susan, I think now the idea is we move into our set of panelists, each of whom I remind you has about 5 or 7 minutes to capture some of the top line lessons learned from the last drought you and your agency are bringing into this drought. And then we should add significant time for conversation amongst the whole DPIIC at the end of the panelists. So honestly, I confess, I forget the order. So which one of you panelists is next? When you go ahead and you raise your hand, there you go, Chad, perfect. And I assume everyone knows who goes after Chad and so on, which would be a domino effect for our own panel here. So Chad, take it away.
Right. Thank you, Chuck. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for having me. My name is Chad Dibble. I'm the Deputy Director of the Ecosystem Conservation Division at the Department of Fish and Wildlife. Yeah, I thought I'd focus my time today on really providing you a brief update on lessons learned from the last drought. So during the last drought, which spanned roughly 2012 to 2016, the department was actively involved on many fronts to not only respond to the conditions we experienced, but really to begin building capacity and resiliency for the future should we find ourselves in the state we're in now. Through the course of the last drought, the department redirected staff and brought in temporary help to the tune of over 200 staff in our wildlife and fisheries functions. That exceeded approximately 150,000 hours of staff time. The work we did conducted on, we focused on several key areas related to monitoring, fish and wildlife rescues and strategies, water system improvements, voluntary drought agreements, temporary fishing closures, addressing human-wildlife conflict, etc. It really expanded the gamut. To give you a couple of examples, in the last drought, we deployed staff to monitor many of our waterways and vulnerable species throughout the state. This allowed us to better understand drought-related threats to these species and help to make resource management decisions. Some of the monitoring we conducted was operated on a 24-hour a day, 7 days a week basis during the heightened migration periods. And this was really critical to help us minimize drought effects and implement Delta-specific regulatory flexibility. The department conducted over 930 fish rescues, exceeding 270,000 fish. Warm river temperatures led to fish response actions such as trucking over 50 million of our salmon smolts to downstream release sites, rather than allowing them to make their way down Central Valley rivers, hopefully improving their chances of survival. All totaled, I think we brought more than 3,000 fish into captivity and more than 100 aquatic dependent terrestrial animals that were then cared for until the habitats recovered and we could return those critters to the wild. We implemented water use efficiency projects and helped conserve water and improve function and resiliency at our facilities. These were wise investments the state made with, installing water circulation systems, chillers, UV systems to kill pathogens, and build new fish tanks to rear trout and salmon and steelhead under abnormal conditions. We worked quickly with the National Marine Fisheries Service, the Water Board, local landowners, and irrigation districts to negotiate voluntary agreements, which I think Kathy's going to talk a little bit about later. But really the key was that this enabled us to monitor and rescue fish, develop forbearance agreements, modify in-stream flow requirements, and really try and strike an appropriate balance for people and the environment. We also implemented a successful human-wildlife conflict program that continues today. We had over 20,000 human-wildlife conflict incidents reported between 2015 and 2017. That's a ton. What we learned was that in situations like this, it really is all hands on deck and that we need to be rowing in the same direction. Partnerships matter, people matter, and our public trust resources matter. As the Resource Agency Drought Report and the LAO Drought Report point out, these efforts take a tremendous amount of resources and support from all levels, which we're again experiencing now. We also learned that we are not as prepared for what seems to be a recurring theme for our state. We need to be able to respond at a moment's notice but also we need to continue to build resiliency if we're going to lessen the impacts of drought and provide water for us in the environment. We need better access to real-time data on stream flow and water temperature, including the ability to profile cold water pool at our reservoirs, and in particular, those reservoirs that are direct source to our hatcheries. And lastly, we learned that we need more support in the IT world for ecological mapping, data management, and programming. These are critical components that help support decision-making and communication, but they're often overlooked as we all dive into in-field responses and we're also busy with just trying to get on the field and deal with what's going on now. So I know my time is limited, and I'll turn it back to Director Bonham and the panel, but I just wanted to give you a little glimpse of what I think we're in for, what we're already doing now, and what's to come in front of us should drought continue and persist as long as it did during the last time. So thank you, and I'll be available for questions as we move forward. Kathy, were you next?
Yes, I am next. Thanks, Chad. Good memory. And I did have some slides. Thanks, Brandon's getting those up here for me. Just something more to look at rather than my bedroom office, which I'm getting tired of after this long being out of the office. But good afternoon. I'm Kathy Marcinkiewicz. I'm the Assistant Regional Administrator for NOAA Fisheries California Central Valley Office here in California, or in Sacramento. I appreciate the opportunity to be part of this panel and for the DPIIC playing a role in really fostering and advocating for this approach to drought. Let's move on to the next slide, please, Brennan. So as a representative of NOAA, the home of climate.gov, which if you haven't checked out, you definitely should. There's a lot to explore there. I'll propose that we consider drought in the context of the challenge associated with climate change. So while these dry stretches are incredibly difficult to manage, so are the wetter years that are in between. And those stretches will only become more challenging when we include the risks of fire scars and mudslides and flooding and the limitations of aging infrastructure. So our long dry stretches may be relieved by only very short and more infrequent wet periods, and it's probably time to kind of widen what we thought were the boundaries of the both ends of the extreme conditions. Next slide. As for some lessons learned, the last drought informed some actions that moved in the right direction, and we have carried those through to this year as well. Chad teased a little bit of the Voluntary Drought Initiative, and that's a program between NOAA Fisheries and the Department of Fish and Wildlife that began during the last drought and is being restarted this year. And under this program, water users and landowners can willingly provide water conservation actions or in-stream flows that would improve the regulatory certainty for those users. And these actions tend to be focused on smaller tributaries. Sometimes those don't make the press or the news as much, but they're incredibly important as well. And they're guided by our recovery plan to provide benefits to salmonids and sturgeon in low water years. Next slide. So in response to the previous drought, hatchery production of winter run Chinook salmon purposely increased. And this allowed for a really opportunistic move in 2018 of putting those hatchery fish into Battle Creek, where they had been historically, but not in several decades. And this expedited a planned reintroduction of Chinook salmon into that stream that had already been in process, but not quite implemented yet. And just 2 years later, in 2020, we saw over 1,000 adult fish come back from the ocean and successfully spawn in Battle Creek. It was the first time in perhaps 100 years, depending on whose records you look at. And I mention this effort in particular because for NOAA Fisheries, establishing additional populations of our species in higher elevation, colder streams that they can't access right now is a key to protect and recover the species in the face of climate change. So we're exploring other opportunities for reintroductions throughout the Central Valley. You'll hear in a few minutes from Rosemary about the utility of the existing monitoring network in the Delta. That we can always use these challenging situations to learn more about where we can boost our scientific knowledge. The challenges of this year, as Chuck alluded to, have daylighted where some of our watershed monitoring systems may need some attention to provide better predictions of reservoir inflow. We could probably identify additional metrics to provide earlier warning of potential drought conditions. And we need to identify how we can integrate the work that Rosemary will talk about with similar work upriver outside of the Delta, because some Delta species actually span the headwaters of the ocean. And my 4-year-old just ran through the room. So the full ecosystem-based management approach ideally would encapsulate the full geography of the life cycle from mountain streams through the Delta to the ocean and back. Next slide, please. So finally, we can manage for resilience and ideally for species recovery by taking actions that create a more hospitable landscape for listed fish species, and by shifting our approach to consider extremes the norm. And those actions include reintroducing fish into historic habitats where conditions are colder, advancing landscape scale habitat projects such as floodplain restoration that improve growth and survival for fish even during dry conditions, and implementing in-stream flow and fish passage projects that target drought conditions. And though we learn enough to start planning for drought earlier and earlier every year, and we use what we consider to be conservative projections, it seems we are to the point where an assumed drought should almost be the starting point in any given year, and then we manage away from that if the conditions become wetter. And then in the wetter years, we need to make sure that we lengthen our memories and don't forget the recent dry years, and really consider what needs to be done to make the most of that wet year, assuming that the next one or two could be dry or will be dry. So drought planning needs to be constant so that we can be as proactive as prepared as possible to manage the extreme conditions that we'll encounter. So I think my time is close to up, and I believe that Michael is up after me. Thanks.
Thanks, Kathy. So I've been asked to use my 5 minutes in the panel to focus more narrowly on the legal delta, on what happens at the bottom of the system. Next slide, please. So first of all, starting with what's different about drought in the delta, because within the delta, drought is experienced differently than it is in most of the watershed in most of the state. It's not an absence of physical water, but it's enhanced risk of water quality deterioration that has important consequences for the ecosystem, as well as for other water uses. So I think it's important to kind of change perspective on the delta, that not to think of it as an extension of a riverine system, but as a tidal estuary that has critical river influences, but that it's also different sub-regionally within the area. That's the point of the slide over here. There are different regions within the delta, different governance capabilities within the delta because of the differences in those physical circumstances. So in the delta, the freshwater inflow is critical to protect this highly managed system to prevent salinity from intruding and to maintain a freshwater working estuary for all the water users. So the Delta Plan, of course, is the attempt to organize amid all this complexity. And as both Chuck and Chad have already mentioned, when you think about our modeling capability, the models work pretty well in the middle, in the belly of the bell curve, but it's much more difficult because we have fewer instances at those tails. What we're now looking forward to is that the tails are going to become more prominent, and therefore the need to improve our modeling. Let's go to the next slide. So with that as background, what did we learn from the last drought? As has already been discussed, data, quality data, accessible to everybody, that is credible, so that we are all talking about the same phenomenon in roughly the same period of time. The data wasn't as good as we needed last year. We've done our last drought. We've made a lot of improvements in that since then. Second thing is that we learned that planning earlier and doing actions earlier can have better consequences. And among those are that consistent use of regenerative agricultural practices in the Delta beats fallowing as a short-term emergency response. So overall, advanced planning trumps emergency response. We shouldn't think of droughts as an emergency. It's kind of a slow-moving train wreck that you can see coming a while. Advanced planning, as Kathy has said, is critical. In addition, we recognized that we had a great deal of scientific data, but what we lacked was the ability to synthesize it or align it with what we needed to do in terms of managing. We also recognize that the protocols that we use for permitting and regulatory processes have lead times that are longer than provide the ability to respond quickly as things change. We also recognize, and this continues to be the case, that actions throughout the watershed actually get balanced down at the bottom of the watershed in the Delta. And generally those balances come on the backs of the export projects. And that's one reason why the governor's May 10th proclamation that Chuck mentioned focused specifically on considering emergency regulations to protect the release of stored water. And then of course, finally, as always happens, ecosystem function is the first thing to deteriorate and one of the last to recover. Next slide, please. So this is the evolution, just May, June, and late June of this particular drought, to which we're trying to apply those lessons learned. Next slide, please. So one of the things that is obvious is the water quality deterioration that I mentioned earlier. All three of these pictures were taken just last month. So the problems with deterioration of our water quality are accelerating in time and seriousness. Next slide, please. So what are we doing about it? One of the things that I'm pleased to report is that the 3 Delta water agencies, the North, Central, and South Delta water agencies, as representatives of water users in the Delta, have developed a drought response plan. They've provided leadership, outreach, and collaboration to create a unified voice for Delta water users and to propose a series of actions for constructive consultation to make the circumstances better. They've put forth a plan that has 3 elements. I think of it as 3 legs of the stool: improved data quality and accessibility, and the Delta contributing to that. Conserve water where and how it's possible, because those different regions in the Delta have different capabilities and techniques for conserving water. And then overall protecting that freshwater estuary, so that if we can cooperate on these common objectives, we may be able to manage this drought if it continues and future droughts that are certain to come. So this is, as Chuck said, we don't want to always walk away from these discussions downhearted or depressed. There are some things that are being done, taking the lessons that have been learned, applying them now, and looking forward to better planning going forward. So that's my 5 minutes. And I think now it's on to Rosemary.
Hi, everyone. Thank you very much to all the other panelists. My name's Rosemary Hartman, and I'm from the Department of Water Resources. And I'm here to talk to you a little bit about some of the scientific lessons we learned from the last drought and how we're really working on that key point that Michael brought up in terms of synthesizing the data we have. Next slide. So drought, the dictionary definition is less water than normal, but in California, there's nothing particularly unusual about droughts. 14 of the last 20 years have been below normal, dry or critically dry. So we are certainly no stranger to droughts. And as a scientific community, we've really been able to learn from these previous droughts. In particular, the 2012 through 2016 drought really taught us a lot about drought's impact on the ecosystem, what we need to monitor better, and how we can respond to the droughts for better ecosystem management. Next slide. So just going over some of those major lessons we learned. The most basic, with drought, we have lower flows. Nothing dries out in the Delta, but lower flows, lower exports, and more salinity intrusion. That water quality decreases. Next slide. The other thing that really started to come to a head during the last drought was the impact of low flows on microcystis and other harmful algal blooms and submerged aquatic vegetation. And this is where our monitoring program really kicked into gear, and we realized we need to do a better job monitoring harmful algal blooms and monitoring submerged vegetation. So we've started several new monitoring programs or added to existing monitoring programs since the last drought. Next slide. Phytoplankton and zooplankton. This is where we have a great long-term data set, and we can look over the past 60 years doing that synthesis that Michael was advocating for to see what do we see in terms of phytoplankton and zooplankton when we have long-term droughts versus wet years. There is definitely lower abundance, especially in the fall, for both of these aspects of the ecosystem. However, we're not entirely sure why. So there's a number of research projects going on, mostly funded through Prop 1 and the funding through the Delta Science Program, to try and get at the mechanism. Why do we see so much less production in the fall of dry years for phytoplankton and zooplankton? Next slide. Of course, the endangered fish are what we really worry about during droughts, because most of our native fish, including the Delta smelt and Chinook salmon, tend to decrease during droughts, whereas our invasive fish, particularly ones associated with vegetation like largemouth bass and silversides, tend to increase during droughts. And the last drought kicked off a lot of synthesis to better tease apart which species increase and which species decrease, and what their likelihood of recovery is after the drought. Next slide. So to respond to this current drought, one of the lessons that we learned last time was we need to be better prepared. So the BIOPS and ITPs for the State and Central Valley Water Project now include the condition that we create in collaboration with U.S. Bureau of Reclamation, a drought toolkit of voluntary drought actions we can do to try and adapt our management to better respond to the drought. This year, some of the major things we're doing is the emergency drought barrier that has gone in the head of Falls River, and the temporary urgency change petition, changing our requirements on Delta outflow. And then we not only need to put these things into place, but we need to assess their effectiveness. So that's where the ecosystem monitoring and overall synthesis comes in. Next slide. All these actions are summarized in a drought contingency plan, which DWR and Reclamation has put together, including this synthesis. Next slide. To complete our synthesis, we're taking 3 different prongs. We're looking long-term over the current drought and previous droughts over the entire course of our monitoring, taking a deeper dive into the current drought status, looking for mechanisms, and then trying to see if we can actually detect a ecosystem response to the drought barrier and TUCP. Next slide. The long-term trends, we have this great monitoring network of sites with water quality, fish, etc. We only had to add a little bit of extra microcystis and aquatic weed monitoring to be able to really assess the impact of droughts, but we can do this retrospective analysis to see how the ecosystem as a whole responds. Next slide. For the TUCP, it's a little harder because the impact of our relaxation to flow standards is so small in comparison to the difference between a wet year and a dry year that it's really hard to see an impact in the ecosystem. However, we can use modeling, such as this graph, to see the impact of how things would be if we did business as usual versus the TUCP. And for example, here we see maybe a 2-kilometer increase in X2. Next slide. To assess the effect of the drought barrier, we can compare what's going on in the Sacramento River, where we expect salinity to increase, to what's happening in the Central Delta region, and then compare this year in these 2 regions to last year, which was dry with no barrier, to the previous year, which was wet, and to the previous drought barrier. Next slide. And we want to put this all together into some quick visual summaries. Broad scale, big picture trends. What does drought mean to our ecosystem? And assess these actions that we're taking to allow us to choose new actions that we might take next year, figure out if we need to change any of our current actions, and figure out where we have uncertainties, where we need extra monitoring and new scientific experiments. And that is what I have. And I think now we will go to discussion.
Susan, you want to kick us off for discussion and between the
Sure.
panelists, or?
Yeah, first off, I want to say thank you very much to our panelists. You kept to your time and you presented great information in 5 minutes. It's terrific. One of the things, I heard so many things. First off, I'm very glad to hear that we are learning a lot, and we have learned a lot from past droughts. It's really heartening to me to hear about these partnerships, the importance of partnerships. I wanted to highlight Michael's point about how the Delta is different. And I'm very glad that our North Central and South Delta water agencies have a drought plan. I think what I'm witnessing here is we have a lot of capability. We have, as Rosemary just said, a great monitoring network. We're understanding more and more about the effects of our drought management actions in the Delta ecosystem. And we're all working together to improve our understanding and improve our actions. So with that, I want to hand it over to Chuck, who has some firsthand experience with these actions that have to be taken during drought.
Yep, that's like the 10th time I've been muted today on a Zoom. I owe a big apology to Amanda because I joked last Friday when we connected for figuring this out that I had plenty of time to plan. I can't remember if I'm supposed to ask provocative questions, but if I'm not, here's a couple of them. Rosemary, if you had unlimited resources, what's the one study you'd like to pursue? Michael, why is it that regenerative agriculture is potentially more feasible as a short-term strategy than fallowing? Chad, what's our success metric for trucking these fish down to the estuary and, kind of tracking whether they come back? And then Kathy, let's see if I can come up with a question. How do you get fish around Shasta and into the McCloud, and is that part of recovery? So Rosemary, you want to go first?
Ooh, okay then. Choosing just one is tough.
Yep. Well, the prerogative of the facilitator.
Yes. I think, to me, one of the biggest drought problems that we have right now is the increase in submerged aquatic vegetation and floating vegetation. When flows decrease, this invasive water weeds come in and choke off everything. And they make life terrible for the native fishes. They're a wonderful habitat for invasive largemouth bass that eat our native fishes and don't have a good way of controlling it. The State Parks Division of Boating and Waterways has a treatment program, but there's been a lot of research looking back at this treatment program and finding that we're dumping a lot of pesticides into our estuaries and not really seeing a response on the weeds. It has not been working. We have not been killing the weeds. And they are working on some, alternative, different chemical treatment methods, different physical treatment methods. And so really putting more money and resources behind finding a method to control weeds that actually works, I think would be my number one thing, because it is something that seems feasible and management relevant. There's other things like microcystis is another one that's a huge problem, but I'm not sure we can come up with a treatment method, like a solution to the problem. Whereas the weeds, I feel like there should be a solution there if we can put enough resources behind it.
You figure we put somebody on the moon, we ought to deal with aquatic weeds.
I know.
Michael, tell us, many people quickly think fallowing might be your best tool. Now, I think it's in the toolkit, but what are you seeing in the Delta relative to that versus regenerative ag, which was a phrase in your slide?
So regenerative agriculture is something that saves water as it's implemented over a period of time. It's not an immediate drought response, but the Healthy Soils Program at CDFA and the research that's been done on regenerative agriculture demonstrates that improving the quality of soil, keeping a cover crop, reducing the use of herbicides, pesticides, saves water. In contrast to the attempt to save water through land fallowing, we tried that in 2015. We learned a lot about it. We learned enough about it to know we needed to know more. And so we created a scientific study that was done jointly by Land IQ and UC Davis. But importantly, Chuck, it was funded by the state water contractors, the San Luis Delta Mendota Water Authority, the State Water Board through our office, and farmers in the Delta for people who wanted to understand it better. Now, that study was done in 2018. It's awaiting peer review to appear in the literature. But what we found is that particularly in the deeply subsided Delta, you can't stop farming to save water. There are places where you can save water in the Delta, but throughout the Delta, the water table is pretty close to the root zone. So the savings through fallowing tended to be much less than we had anticipated. We now know a lot more about it, and we know that regenerative agriculture over a long term and improving the quality of our soils saves far more water than occasional fallowing. And you're still muted, Chuck.
Number 10. Susan or Amanda, give me the yank if we're going over. But Chad, how do we know if, last drought, we basically, I don't mean this literally, but got every available FedEx truck in California with Kathy and NIMS and Paul and Fish and Wildlife Service and moved, 50 million fish out. About a week ago, I think we completed moving about 17 million fish out. How do we know that helps or works?
We know it helps in the returns. I think Kathy mentioned one of it with the Battle Creek stuff and trying to just do something different. It's hard, it's complicated. We had ocean problems last time. Hopefully, fingers crossed, we're not going to run into ocean problems, but we think as a stepwise process, that is the right move at this moment in time to move those fish to at least get them past the first hurdle. The next hurdle will be surviving the Delta, making it through the net pen releases, obviously, and then ensuring that they can make it through an ocean survival and starting to see those 2-year numbers come back. But also in the interim, right, if we keep moving forward, continuing to put funds and resources into building resiliency with the purchase of the state investment on the trucks is what allowed us to move quickly and early this year. If we had not made that investment last time, we wouldn't have been able to move those fish this time. We would have been back to FedEx and maybe Amazon now, right? So we got a lot more Amazon trucks on the road this year, but they're all busy with COVID. So we frankly probably would have been in trouble, but we really were able there. Second, it's the hatchery upgrades. So not only being able to then have those fish get out on timely manner, take care of them, or hold them longer in certain places to continue those, but as they come back, also building the habitat so that when they come, there's habitat there, right, in years 2 and 3 and 4, but also managing the water. And there's been some articles lately about reservoir storage and carryover and what we can do. But we've got a 2-year window, right, before we start to see success on those fish coming back. We've got a lot of time, if you think about it, to really start planning for where they might come, preparing for them to come, and ensuring that we have the right timing down so when they do come, they're successful again. And that includes ensuring our hatcheries can bring as many fish back into captivity if the landscape doesn't allow it.
So Kathy, in this idea of if you build it, they'll come, and you mentioned Battle Creek, which is a huge optimistic story. Mm-hmm. They're back. Mm-hmm. And I also think people have that vision elsewhere in the valley, the McCloud, I know I have it in the Klamath where dams block access to about 400 miles of historical habitat. So is that part of the thinking here? We're managing in the moment this drought, but we also need to be thinking a couple years out and what we need to do to get it better across the board.
Yep, absolutely. Yep, playing a long ball here and just kind of getting out of this moment. And your question of would getting Winter and Chinook past Shasta and up into the McCloud contribute to recovery? Yes, our recovery plan calls for Winter Run 3 populations. Right now there's 1. So if we got one in McCloud, we'd be a little step further. We got one kind of started in Battle Creek, but it's a little ups and downs because it's just getting started. And how do we do it? That dam is too tall for a fish to go up a ladder or try to construct a ladder there. So it's likely going to involve some of those trucks that Chad was talking about to move some adults and establishing a collector that collects the juvenile fish after they spawn in the McCloud to come back down and get them before they get to the reservoir, because the reservoir is absolutely no place for a juvenile salmonid to be. It will get eaten in no time. So that takes some science, it takes some money, but we've got some infrastructure already kind of almost at the ready to go. It's just a matter of kind of executing and funding it. They do this in the Northwest kind of a lot more than we do here in California. Every system is its own little project, so some things that fit in some places won't fit in others, but we are definitely looking at how establishing populations in these other cold water streams that stay cold in years like this when temperatures at Keswick are very warm, could help provide some buffering opportunity to get through these types of years. And we need to act now to try to get something in place for several years down the road even. So we kind of really can't miss opportunities.
That's right. Thanks, everybody. Back to you, Susan.
Yeah, thank you, Chuck. This is a great conversation. We have just a couple minutes for DPIIC members to ask a question or two. I would love to keep this conversation going for another afternoon or day. Then make a great conference. Unfortunately, we do have to move on, but are there any DPIIC members who would like to ask a question? Well, I'm not seeing. Oh, there's, okay. Paul.
So thank you, Chuck and the panel. That was exciting. This is the kind of conversation that we could talk for a week straight about. So I feel wishing for more time, but I'll just make a couple quick points. Chuck, you started off saying the climate change cycle of drought, heat, and fire. This is the most acute example of that I've seen in my career, with the collapse of the water systems that we've seen, the drying up of snowpack, and the heat and fire is now upon us. We've got a really difficult fire season ahead. I think we've talked a lot about hatcheries. I'll make the point that hatcheries, we do need science around the trucking piece. We moved some fish further south of where we usually release them at Coleman to Scotty's Landing this year, and we've got an experiment underway to see what kind of return rates we get. So I very much agree with that. I appreciate the points about restoration. What I'd like to just pose to the panel, if you have ideas for refuges too, one of the things that we're talking about doing is trying to secure permanent water for refuges, prioritized in a key way to protect our birds as well. It's all part of the Central Valley system, which ends up in the Delta. So do you have ideas for how we could prioritize and get water for refuges?
So I'll take a little bit of that, Chuck. It's front and center for us, Paul. As you know, we're having conversations now, and I feel like a little bit of it right now is triage mode, right? We're here, we're now, the fall is coming. I feel like Game of Thrones, winter is coming. We've got to figure out what to do, and we're working through that. I think on our lands, and this would be similar for your refuges, during the last drought, we were able to capitalize on some of the investments that in the funding that we received, and we've received some again here to start to do those types of projects like you're mentioning. Along with purchasing water, we would obviously need to get in the game of longer term purchases and securements. but also being able to distribute that water better. And we spent a lot of money on trying to upgrade our infrastructures, lining canals, moving things around, shifting to solar pumps and less energy and better efficiency, and also just more reliability on some of our refuges. I don't have great solutions on how we get permanency there to some of those, but I know it belongs in the partnership world of where the rice farmers are now, where the Delta farmers are now, et cetera. That's really where we're going to make headway, I think, is continuing those partnerships we already have with a lot of those farmers and the duck hunting community, et cetera, and really putting our head together to get some permanency there and think through how it's a win-win or a multi-benefit type project that everybody can benefit from going forward.
And Water for Refuges is detailed in the DWR Reclamation Drought Toolkit in terms of things we need to be thinking about during droughts. I don't have the details off the top of my head, but it is in our range of uses that we know water is needed for. I feel free other people to address the question, but I also just want to put in a plug, since you said that this could be a whole week-long conference. It's not going to be a week long, but the Delta Science Program is starting to plan a drought symposium, probably a one-day thing this winter to just prep lessons learned from the past year and start thinking about if next year is also dry, what are we going to do next? Refuges might be one of those things we need to put more effort towards.
I'd like to just underscore that what we got to be doing is taking what we've learned this year and applying it early to planning for next year. It is too late if we decide in January that we want farmers, or frankly anybody else, to take actions. The time frame has to be much earlier. And I think it was Rosemary who said we should plan for drought and move away from it if we get water, because drought is the scourge that needs advanced planning.
And it's a lot easier to, fill out all the forms and do all the planning to put in an emergency drought barrier and then decide you don't need it, then try and scramble and get everything done in a month when you find out too late that you do need it.
Thanks a lot.
Definitely. Well, I wish we could continue. We will likely take this topic up again in October at the October DPIIC meeting. And at that time, I will likely ask a different DPIIC leader to facilitate the discussion. But thank you all. Thank you, Chuck, and the panelists. And we'll move on to the next item. Before we move on, though, I want to go back and offer DPIIC members, I am remiss in offering you an opportunity to either comment on our March 2021 DPIIC meeting summary or give us a quick update. So do any DPIIC members have any corrections to the March 2021 DPIIC meeting summary? Okay, I don't see any hand raised, so we'll assume the summary is as accurate. And are there any updates from any DPIIC members? Okay. I'm not seeing hand raised at this point. In that case, I'm going to go back to a little bit of housekeeping about public comment. So if any member of the public is interested in providing public comment, please send an email blue card to the clerk at engage@deltacouncil.ca.gov. Be sure to note your name and the agenda item you wish to speak on. Also, please note if you wish to speak or would like the clerk to read your comment for you. And when called upon, the clerk will unmute you or read your comment if requested. So on that note, are there any comments on agenda item 2, ecosystem-based management during drought?
No, Madam Chair, there is no public comment.
Thank you, Eric. Well, then let's move on to agenda item 3, updates on Delta Science. Our lead scientist, Dr. Laurel Larson, will kick us off on this item and take us through the agenda item. Hi, Laurel. I think you're on mute.
Can you all hear me now? Okay. I'm getting the message that the host disabled screen sharing for attendees.
Oh, 1 second. Let me change that.
And I can't hear you, Brandon. Hold on. I'm not getting any sound.
Can you hear me now?
Perhaps in the interest of time, we should go to Dr. Jessica Rudnick and I'll work out my sound issues and communicate with Brandon about getting the slides shared.
Sure, I'm happy to start. Laurel, I can hear you fine, no problem. But you still may not be hearing us. Okay, well, good afternoon, everyone. I appreciate the chance to be here today. My name is Jessica Rudnick. I'm the California Sea Grant Social Science Extension Specialist, and I am based at the Delta Stewardship Council. I started in this new role in December 2020 and was supposed to join you all for the spring DPIIC meeting, but was kept away under our team's global outage. So I'm here to give a bit of background on our social science integration efforts and provide some updates from the last presentation you saw about the social science work being done at the Delta Stewardship Council. So just a brief note on me, I was trained as an environmental social scientist and completed my master's and PhD in human ecology at UC Davis. And I was a Delta Science Fellow, so appreciate that program very much. And my research really focuses on human behavior and decision-making, particularly in the context of agriculture, water, and environmental issues in California. And the Delta is of particular interest because of the collaborative governance structures and the way that we can think about what motivates cooperation of these common pool resources. And so the human components of the system are, I think, endlessly fascinating and interesting, and that's why the social science work here is particularly exciting. So you all received a presentation about a year ago from my colleague Rachel Klopfenstein, who shared the results of the social science task force effort in the Delta. That was completed in spring 2020, and we're starting to grow on that vision and build a more integrated interdisciplinary approach for Delta science. So today I'll share some of our updates some progress that we've made over the last year. Next slide, please, Brandon. Thank you. So I wanted to start with this figure, which is Eleanor Ostrom, the first woman to win the Nobel Prize in economics, and for her influential work on political economy and collaborative natural resource governance. And the framework here really developed with the ecological system. And what Dr. Ostrom meant
Brandon, are you able to hear me?
I can hear you, although I think we just lost Dr. Rudnick.
Yeah, her feed is intermittent. How do we convey that to her?
And I can message her on Teams and see if she can. Oh, it's like, yeah, she just dropped off now too.
Laurel, are you able to hear us now?
Dr. Larson, it looks like you're unmuted now, so you should be able to. Can you hear us?
Yes, I can hear you. Is it my turn?
Oh, yes, Laurel, I think we'll go back to you because we lost Jessica.
Oh, no. Okay. Okay, let me try to share my screen, and I apologize, everyone, for the technical difficulties today. Let me try to share the screen. Can you all see my screen right now?
Yes.
Great. Okay, well, I'm delighted to be here at my second DPIIC meeting, and I look forward to working with all of you. I'm going to take 10 minutes this afternoon to hit the highlights of my vision as Delta lead scientist and provide an update on the science action agenda. And I'll just say that this vision has greatly benefited from helpful input from folks throughout the whole Delta Science Network. It won't be possible to realize this vision without the support of DPIIC member agencies, so I would deeply appreciate your feedback as well. My vision is grounded in the fact that if we look ahead, the biggest management challenges for the Delta involve multiple timescales. For instance, managing for short-term flood conditions while preserving storage for long-term shifts in seasonality, spatial scales that span the whole landscape, and diverse intersecting variables that collectively influence the co-equal goals. I've cultivated many aspects of my vision based on observations of how this large-scale, systems-oriented science governance has emerged in other systems. One that gives me a lot of inspiration is the Everglades. I started working in the Everglades during its own era of combat science. The Everglades planning community was repeatedly lambasted by the National Research Council for making scant progress in Everglades restoration, but by around 2016, things had shifted. The Central Everglades Planning Project, at the heart of the Comprehensive Everglades Restoration Plan, had the tricky objectives of enhancing flows to the Everglades while maintaining flood control and water supply to urban South Florida and pristine water quality within the Everglades wetlands. The whole planning process was completed in just 18 months, less than half the time an Army Corps project of that size typically takes. So what happened? Well, a strong interagency modeling group was formed, and the lead agencies conducted 16 public workshops to develop the plan that you see here. These workshops resulted in objectives for fluxes across 4 key boundaries of the Everglades, and then delved into alternative plans of action to achieve those objectives. The success of those workshops hinged on bringing in stakeholders at the stage of designing the objectives, and then allowing them to essentially drive the models and the scenarios that were run. Engagement in this process completely allayed critical concerns of some of the formerly resistant stakeholders and allowed others to adopt compromise more willingly. If you look at places like the Everglades, as well as other comparable systems, it seems there are a set of discrete phases that these systems pass through in order to develop the capability to effectively engage in science-based governance at the landscape scale, the phase that I'm calling convergence here. In the example of SEP, it was only possible for the planning process to occur so rapidly and successfully because it built upon decades of work to resolve scientific uncertainty and develop the models that would ultimately become the building blocks of the integrated models used in planning, and to build relationships and trust. often through smaller scale interagency projects. It's really these two things, the building of social capital and of scientific understanding, that enables systems to transition from phase 1 ultimately to phase 3. I don't have time to get into the details here, but in the Delta, I do think that we're poised to tip into a phase of convergence. We have a lot of models to work with. State of Bay Delta science is full of studies that have advanced scientific understanding of our system. And Frank's Tract and the CVPIA project are great smaller scale examples of the type of stakeholder engaged adaptive management that ultimately needs to happen at the landscape scale. And we have many yes.
Sorry to interrupt really quick. Yeah, so the sharing view that you're showing isn't the presentation, it's just the PowerPoint program. And it doesn't look like you're advancing slides either.
Oh, okay. Let me, I am seeing the slide presentation view.
Maybe. So if you go to,
can you see?
If you go to the top left where it says from beginning, does that, that should give us the view.
Okay, that's what I had done. Are you seeing the slides advanced now?
No, we're still seeing the PowerPoint view.
Actually, I did see slide 5 pop up momentarily. So I don't know if there's a delay.
Okay. So you're not looking at the salinity barrier right now?
Not since you took us back to the beginning, but I did see slide 5 previously.
Okay. Maybe what I could do is give the talk without the slides. That might be best in the interest of time. So let me exit the slideshow. I could send the slide out to DPIIC members after the fact, but I think given the current situation, it might just be best for me to just verbally give the presentation. Okay. So I was basically going to say that we have many opportunities to develop this sort of approach to science and planning in order to deal with landscape scale challenges that require juggling multiple objectives, affecting multiple variables, and rife with trade-offs. Two of these immediate opportunities are the challenge of salinity management during the drought and the ongoing voluntary agreements negotiations. With regard to the former, imagine if outside the context of an immediate drought emergency, we collectively develop spatially explicit objectives for managing salinity during drought and use models to explore the suite of economic, social, ecological, and physical outcomes associated with salinity barriers, such as the one at False River, and potentially operable salinity gates. One desirable outcome of a series of workshops devoted to this process might be a decision tree for installing, removing, and operating salinity barriers and/or gates, one that would be adaptively adjusted based on observations and actual experience. With respect to the voluntary agreements, so the ship might have already sailed with respect to current negotiations on the Tuolumne and the Yuba, there are opportunities to productively learn from those experiences and influence the process for future negotiations on these same or other tributaries in a manner that enhances trust. Doing so requires that we take advantage of this opportunity for social science research. So speaking of opportunities, now is the right time to think big about Delta science. We're under a federal administration that's quite favorable to science, and there are parallel opportunities at the state level. The Act to Restore the San Francisco Estuary and the Federal Infrastructure Bill will be funneling funds toward our region, but building something big with those funds is going to require vision and a lot of interagency collaboration. So let me plant a seed. The Delta and the greater estuary truly function as the heart of California. Water, our state's lifeblood, is pumped through this region to and from distal parts of our state and the ocean by tides, man-made pumps, and river currents. It's a zone of great mixing, and it's critical to our state. I would like to see us develop a Heart of California Center for Synthesis and Collaborative Decision-Making. One function of this center would be to house the collaboratory that former Delta lead scientist Peter Goodwin called for by providing cyber infrastructure support for making models interoperable and be able to provide real-time forecasts and decision support tools. Another function would be to promote synthesis, but equally as important, yet another function of this center would be to promote trust and the building of social capital that I just talked about. I envision that it would include staff trained in facilitation who could help run workshops that effectively engage stakeholders and promote the fundamental shift in how we do large-scale science that I talked about earlier. Now, a second key element of my vision is action. We can model the heck out of the Delta and never be quite satisfied, but a real great leap in learning will come when we actually begin implementing our scenarios and then adaptively refining our models. This process, incidentally, is yet another one that could build trust in the scientific process. We've heard about some nature-based solutions for promoting drought resilience here, and I'll just add that conducting pilot scale studies that over time increase in scale will begin to resolve questions about their impacts over longer timescales or larger spatial scales. Again, there's already been a lot of great work done in this area that we should build on, including pilot studies of managed floodplain inundation and large-scale flow manipulation, such as the Sassoon Marsh salinity control gates. Last, outreach and communication of our science and the scientific process are critical to building trust. And I do have several ideas on areas that we can and should build up. Certainly a lot of this outreach is already being done by DPIIC member agencies, but it would be great to see more interagency partnerships focused on science communication. With that, I'm going to segue into my brief update on the update of the Science Action Agenda, which in itself is a great example of this process of co-production that I've been talking about. So as many of you know, the Science Action Agenda is a key forward-looking component of the Delta Science Strategy. It sets the priorities for science at the 4 to 5 year time span and guides science investments by multiple agencies. The current Science Action Agenda, spanning the 2017 to 2021 time period, resulted in $36 million in targeted foundational research that directly addresses priority science actions. The Science Action Agenda provides a set of these priority science actions that aim to generate information or create tools that advance policy and address the physical, natural, and socioeconomic challenges of the Delta. They're ultimately responsive to broad management needs that span multiple agencies. A new element of the process for this update to the Science Action Agenda was to solicit management questions from the community in order to identify the most salient, pressing management needs. Through surveys conducted in early fall 2020, we received nearly 1,300 submitted management questions from the Delta science community. Through a September 2020 workshop, that list was narrowed to 110 and then streamlined further to 65 top management questions by Delta Science program staff. Management questions were then grouped thematically by DSP staff to identify a set of 6 main management needs, and the draft management needs document is now out. Finally, in a workshop that will take place tomorrow and Wednesday, participants will draft science actions that are responsive to each of those management needs, guided by the top 65 management questions. The drafting of those science actions will also be guided by an assessment of progress made on the 25 science actions in the last Science Action Agenda, noting particularly any big lack of progress on those science actions. Many of you participated in the information gathering that we undertook as part of the progress summary, and thank you for that. Altogether, the DSP staff compiled a list of almost 300 activities from documents, stakeholders, and collaborative groups, and used that list to assign a progress status for each of the science actions and action areas, which is also available online using a link that I can send you all in the slides. After the new science actions are drafted in the upcoming workshop, they will be prioritized by DSP staff using a set of prioritization criteria that will be refined in the workshop. We anticipate that by fall, a draft will be available for public review, followed by publication of the document in winter 2022. And with that, I'm going to close my presentation. Again, apologies for the technical difficulties.
Thank you, Laurel. Your slides that go with your vision are excellent. It's unfortunate we weren't able to see them, but thank you for pressing forward. Brandon, do we have Dr. Rudnick back?
Yes, she's back on.
Okay. Hey, Jessica.
Hello. Hi, all again. Seems like the greater forces of the virtual workspace just really don't want this presentation to happen. But thank you, Laurel, for picking up, and you set this up well with all of the motivation and support for an interdisciplinary approach in the Delta Science program. So I will go ahead and jump ahead, but where I left off, the social ecological system is sort of a conceptual framework for really thinking about how these components of the biophysical and ecological systems interact with the social, political, human systems of the estuary. And so this is our goal for the social science integration strategy, is really to think about where we can have these intersections, how we form interdisciplinary teams to study the interactions between these components of the system, and then how we translate that science into management and policy or actionable approaches to reach some of the outcomes of interest, like resilience and equity and sustainability. I'll go on to the next slide, please, Brandon. Thank you. And so this was the social science strategy for the Delta that was presented about a year ago, which has really catalyzed a lot of the momentum towards building social science and investing in this component of the system. So the social science task force was an external team of social scientists from across the country that really took an assessment of what's going on in the Delta and identified the status, the state of social science, and provided a set of recommendations among their 3 findings that helped to guide us forward in this next phase. So their first finding was that there's generally a lack of social science capacity and investment in the system. And so recommendations around this finding are to really build in both the people that can do this work and the resources dedicated to this work. The second large finding was that there are multiple social science research activities going on within the Delta and throughout the state that focus on different aspects of the human dimensions of the Delta, but there's not a lot of coordination or integration across those efforts. And there's not a lot of integration of those efforts into some of the other Delta science conversations. And so the recommendations here are really to invest in developing that conceptual framework that integrates across these different components of the social, political, cultural systems, and think about how we develop more cohesive and holistic approaches to monitoring some of the social components of the system that sort of mirror what we have in terms of long-term ecological monitoring. And then finally, the third finding of the task force was that the adaptive management process really needs more integration of social science in terms of how we build trust, how we learn, what facilitates cooperation and adaptive decision-making. And so the recommendations here are to really study those processes of how in that adaptive management cyclical process, we know how to move from one stage to the next and how to create science into different decision-making processes. So next slide, please. So that social science task force strategy really forms the basis for a strategic plan for social science integration. And our social science integration team at the Delta Stewardship Council now is working on a 3-legged stool approach here to build that capacity and literacy for social science research, both among agency staff and within the broader scientific community, to work on coordinating and collaborating to synthesize the studies that have been done, the research that we do have, and to promote a more interdisciplinary research agenda. And then to think about how we start to translate and integrate those findings into management and policy decisions. So I want to spend just a few minutes highlighting some of the progress that we've made on these 3 elements of our vision. And this is just over the past couple of months. So really early stuff here. Next slide, please. Related to capacity building, we've been working both
Jess, it sounds like we just lost you again. I'm going to switch you over to that phone number we talked about. Hi, Jess. Can you hear us? You should be able to unmute yourself now. *6.
I'm here.
Oh, there you are.
I apologize. I'm not sure what's happening. We've also developed this social science community of practice, which we began with a kickoff event at the Bay Delta Science Conference in April, where we had over 70 attendees of a lot of researchers, a lot of agency staff from many of your agencies, a lot of practitioners in the field who really know the communities of the Delta well and are excited to work in more of a research framework. And so we're starting to build this community of folks who can really work to better understand the people that live in the estuary. Next slide, please. Thank you. And one of the key purposes of building this social science community of practice is really to forward that idea of one estuary, one science, where we know that one science needs to include social sciences as well. And so this community of practice builds a space for these researchers who focus on human dimensions to really integrate into some of the existing collaborative science venues in the Delta. So the network diagram on the left of your screen comes out of the 2019 Delta Science Plan. And it's a map of all the collaborative science venues that exist in the Delta in the darker blue circles, and then the member agencies and organizations that participate in these. And we asked the folks who have joined the social science community of practice, how often do you participate in these? Are you part of this growing dialogue and collaborative science understanding of the Delta? And by and large, we found that very few social scientists are participating in these venues. And so the social science community of practice is a start to try to address this gap and integrate those social scientists who are interested or working in the system into these existing venues, as well as to pursue some activities that focus more clearly on some of the human dimensions research questions. Next slide, please. So this really contributes to that second leg of the stool, coordinating and collaborating to synthesize available research and develop interdisciplinary research priorities and activities. And so the social science community of practice has developed a starting list of research priorities and activities needed, and are actively contributing to the science action agenda, as Dr. Larson mentioned, is coming up later this week. We're also looking at exploring opportunities like workshops, symposium, brown bags to build our understanding of the people and the social components of this system, and to share and learn from that knowledge. So we have a first seminar series planned for this fall quarter focused on environmental justice, and there will be 4 public seminars throughout the fall that feature different scholars and practitioners working on different elements of equity and justice in the Delta. We're also working on synthesizing some of the past research that's been done in the Bay and Delta to build a more comprehensive picture of what we know about the people living in this area, and starting to think about how we integrate those research priorities and research gaps into the overall Delta science priorities and funding calls. And finally, we're thinking about where there are big opportunities for sort of comprehensive and longitudinal research projects that can leverage this community of practice and integrate across the multiple agencies and organizations working in the system. So I want to highlight one of those that I'm excited to start developing. Next slide, please. and that is a longitudinal survey of Delta residents. And so the idea here is that we really don't know a ton about the folks who live and work within the boundaries of the legal Delta. And there are a lot of questions about livelihood, well-being, how people respond to rapid environmental changes that we're experiencing right now. And what we need to know that allows our understanding of the social systems to be integrated into some of the ongoing projects throughout the Delta, including the Delta Adapts Climate Change Adaptation Initiative, drought response, particularly relevant and timely for today's meeting. And so we're looking to build a coordinated effort across many of the agencies represented on the DPIIC to start building a demographically representative and statistically significant data set of the people in the Delta. And hopefully this becomes more of a longitudinal monitoring effort, like I said, to mirror what we see in the ecological monitoring, the data that we have around ecological monitoring. Some of the topics that we're interested in exploring include, but are not limited to, people's relationship to the Delta, so where they work, live, or play, their ties to the Delta historically, their observations of change in the Delta as a place and how we characterize the values, beliefs, and social norms of the people living in this region, how we think about good governance and whether the residents of this area have strong perceptions of government, what their knowledge of different policy processes look like, how they access participation opportunities or how they feel represented in decisions made. And like I mentioned, we can sync up timely and relevant research topics and projects and integrate that into the longitudinal survey data collection, which allows us to study topics like climate change risk perception or drought impacts and adaptation in the face of these changes. And so our goal is to begin to collaboratively develop this survey instrument, and in doing so, address different questions that have arisen through the Science Action Agenda, through the Delta Adapts project, and from your agencies as well. So we will be integrating with other ongoing efforts. And next slide, please. And we've looked at past efforts as well. So we're aiming to leverage the existing data that is available from past research that's happened in the Delta and build off of that data that could be considered baseline information. So in the past over the past month, a couple of folks on our social science team have really worked hard to synthesize what past survey research has been done in the Delta. We've identified 19 surveys conducted of Delta residents or various subpopulations over the past 25 years. The folks who've been primarily targeted, the focus of those surveys have been recreationalists, a lot of registered fishers, boaters, hunters, trail users. There have been a few surveys of Delta residents. One that is fairly familiar and recent was the Department of Water Resources Environmental Justice Survey. And a few have engaged stakeholders, so really targeting people who participate frequently and often in policy process. And a lot of the topics that these surveys have explored have focused heavily on recreational use of the system, economics related to tourism and recreation, a couple of efforts to understand resident and users' attitudes towards different Delta issues, and a surprising number of surveys looking at fish consumption, both by sport fishers and folks eating fish for subsistence. We've seen a variety of different distribution approaches, but so far we've had very little success in finding efforts to look at sort of a random sample of residents of the region or focus across multiple issues rather than a single topical focus at a time. We've had very little success finding any past research efforts to distinguish attitudes towards issues across different Delta user groups or demographics. We really don't know a lot about environmental beliefs or behaviors, stewardship behaviors, risk perception, climate adaptive capacity, or social issues like housing stability, employment, food security, or drinking water. And so there's a lot that we have learned from these past efforts that we can continue to build on and grow. And there are a lot of gaps that we've identified that we really don't know and are critical for our understanding of how we build management and policy approaches that effectively bring the people of this region along through change to adapt to the rapid environmental changes that we're seeing. So with that, I will close for now. The ask is that we hope this effort can be supported and that your member agencies can contribute and provide input throughout the development of both this activity as well as the rest of our social science integration efforts. So looking forward to time for questions and any thoughts on how to continue moving forward on this. Thank you, and thanks for your patience with my horrible Zoom connection.
Thank you, Dr. Rednick. I think in the interest of time, let's move on to Mario Manzo with the update on the Delta Crosscut budget, and then we'll go back to DPIIC members' questions of any of you.
Perfect. Thank you, Chair Tatiana, and everyone for the opportunity to present on the second annual Delta Crosscut Budget Report. I'm just going to highlight some key figures from the budget report. I hope you open up the actual budget report and read through it. It's pretty short, it's only 26 pages, and most of that's figures with quick and good facts. So next slide, please. The budget report builds upon last year's inaugural budget report, with the focus being improved efficiency. As we collect more years of data, the budget report will help decision makers prioritize future science funding. As you will see today, as we go through some of the other slides and when you open up the report, with 2 years of reporting, it's really just too premature to make funding or policy recommendations at this time. Still, the report gets us closer to informing our effort to make science funding more effective. Next slide, please. This is a fun figure. So when you go into the report, it's I hope you spend some time and think about this one. So this compares last year's and this year's numbers. So we know a couple of reasons why these bars are different. So one is we have more agencies reporting than we did in the first year. So thank you for those additional agencies and getting that information into here. And two, we've gotten better at identifying the correct categories. So often you'll find that core monitoring and synthesis might be in the same contract. So now we've been doing better about being able to bifurcate those apart. But that really only describes a small portion of the increases and the changes across the categories that we see here in the slide. So again, we need more data to determine if this is just an anomaly of 2 years comparing, or this is something we should expect across years to see kind of a cyclical change in the data and across the categories, or whether it's something entirely different, again, just needing more data. For right now, though, we're doing great getting everyone to report and in the right categories. So we're on the right track. Next slide, please. So when you open the report, you'll see the other agencies' sources of funding, and you'll see that in general, everyone has one source of funding. So this slide just highlights the need for a discussion once we have enough years of data on the robustness of sources of funding that we have in the Delta communities and what necessary safeguards may need to be employed to ensure reliable funding for our science needs. Next slide, please. So this slide is the first of 2 major improvements we made from last year's budget report. Folks were particularly interested in reclamation's reimbursability and how we determine our reimbursable and non-reimbursable costs. There is some overlap with the other agencies, but in general, it's when we talk about reimbursability, it's a reclamation specific term. So the quick way of thinking about reimbursability is that reimbursable means the portion the federal water contractors and power customers pay, and non-reimbursable means the portion not paid by the federal water contractors and power customers because it's either cost shared, generally with the state of California, or a federal taxpayer expense. So as you can see from the slide here, the reimbursable portion of science expenditures is about 60%, with the non-reimbursable portion being 40%. And that's reversed for our habitat expenditures, where 60% is non-reimbursable and 40% is reimbursable. And that has to do with the underlying or the authorities that are used for reclamation implementing the work. Based on the various authorities that we have, dictates the reimbursability that reclamation has associated with it. And in general, habitat expenditures are something that come under the CVPIA provisions, which generally can be characterized, although my boss would give me all the details of why it's more complicated than that, but can be generally characterized as 37.5% reimbursable. Next slide, please. So this is the second major improvement that we made this year, and this was a lot of effort and a big change from what we had before. So we had the initial science request focusing on the science aspects of it, and when we talked about it last year, it was identified that habitat and the improvements we make to habitat, along with the research associated with it, is a big component of the science enterprise that is in the Delta. So this is a pilot effort to collect restoration funding data. This data is presented separately from the science data and reflects funds spent on acquisition, permitting, construction, and ongoing post-construction costs for a range of habitat projects. Areas for improvement in the collection and presentation of the restoration data and the science data will be identified as we adaptively manage the collecting and reporting of this information. It's a really long way of saying tracking the habitat project and how it relates to habitat and projects and science is quite complicated. And so we continue to work together as the DPIIC agencies to unpack that and make sure we're presenting this information in a reliable and defensible manner. Next slide, please. Oh, so there was a lot of work that went into this report, and I want to thank all the DPIIC members for making their staff available for this effort. While it was half the effort of the first year, and we're getting a good rhythm as we're going forward, I know it takes a lot of their time, and so I thank you for that. As a long-term solution, the Delta Stewardship Council continues to work on the Delta Science Tracker to be able to auto-populate this information and make the information accessible online. Until then, particular thanks are due to Amanda Bowl and Edmund Yu from the Delta Science Council, Brooke White, Delissa Bloxham, and Jill LaRocco from Reclamation, and Tara Alpa and the Kearns and West team for pulling the entire report together. It's again, it's only 26 pages. It's a short read, but as you can imagine, it takes a lot of work to try to condense it down and make it something readable. So appreciate all the hard work of those folks in making it the second annual report. So, and then finally, we look forward to continuing to work with DPIIC leaders to annually report this essential information in a transparent and usable way as we work together to build a more effective Delta Science enterprise. And again, hope you all open up and enjoy the budget report. That's it. Thanks, Susan.
Yep, thank you, Mario, and thank you for all your hard work on this. To the whole team, it's great to see that we're getting more information. Pretty soon we'll be getting more clear information about the finer components. So Delta DPIIC members, are there any questions for Dr. Larson or Dr. Rudnick or Mario Manzo? I can't see the hand raising, Brendan. My program still does not show me who is raising hands.
I don't see any at the moment either.
Oh, okay. Well, then I have a question for Mario on the habitat restoration. Is the idea that we're trying to get a handle on science that will evaluate the effects of habitat restoration?
Yes, that's perfect.
Okay.
So a couple of things as we're trying to unpack those costs is the way that it came into the conversation is exactly the way you just described it. Of there's an incredible amount of monitoring and information that goes as part of, you go build the project and then you monitor it and try to understand, is it producing the system-wide effects or localized effects that you're trying to produce as a result of building it. And so there's a lot of what we would characterize as science monitoring, which is part of the other pot of money that we're trying to identify. And so it's trying to come up with a way to evaluate all the funding that we're spending on habitat improvements and the monitoring associated with that, while at the same time not necessarily bringing in all the real estate and land acquisition costs that are quite sizable when you're thinking about the science monitoring enterprise, and potentially inflating from a discussion point about how much is being spent on science and monitoring. So it's just trying to make sure we have data in a way that is transparent and folks can talk about it on a level playing field.
Excellent. Okay, thank you. And was that a hand? I see someone has their hand raised. I just can't.
Yes, Ellen Blake from US EPA has her hand.
Thank you. Hi, Ellen. Is it?
Ellen, looks like you're muted.
Talking up a storm here. Thank you. I had a question for Dr. Rudnick. So you had mentioned that there's some workshops this fall that are going to focus on environmental justice as part of the social science program. Can you talk a little bit about that and maybe tell us what those workshops are about?
Yeah, sure. So the Delta Stewardship Council is starting an environmental justice initiative involving a white paper to start outlining what the issues around environmental justice are in the Delta, who's working on them, and hopefully involving community groups in identifying policy options going forward. As part of the effort of just building our knowledge around what environmental justice research looks like and what some of the pressing research ideas in the field are, we're concurrently planning a 4-session brown bag seminar series. So there'll be 4 lunchtime talks for public policy audiences. We're inviting some top environmental justice scholars and policy folks from across the state. Karen Gutierrez, our Sea Grant Fellow, is helping to plan this. It's a joint effort between the environmental justice team and science communication. And so as we have the speaker names confirmed and dates, we'll make sure to send that information out broadly.
Great, thank you.
Okay, are there any other questions from DPIIC members? Okay, hearing none, is there any public comment on this item?
No, Madam Chair, there is no public comment.
Thank you, Eric. Well, thank you, Laurel and Jess and Mario, on this Delta Science updates. That takes us to agenda item 4. Our next DPIIC meeting will be October 18, and will likely be in person. And we're hoping that we can hold it in the new California Natural Resources Agency building, which I hear has some great meeting technology. So we hopefully won't have any technical difficulties at that time. So I look forward to seeing all of you October 18 in person. In the meantime, stay cool, and we'll see you next time.
Thanks, Susan.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.